Joseph's brothers came to Egypt to buy food, 10 brothers. He recognized them. They did not recognize him. Eventually, they go back home with grain, enough to feed their families, and Joseph tells them, when you come back, make sure you bring Benjamin, your youngest brother. He didn't say him by name, but he said, bring your youngest brother that you've told me about. And when you come back, then Simeon, who's being held hostage right now, can be returned to your family. So now as we come to chapter 43, it's time for the brothers to go back to Egypt. So in chapter 43 and verse 1, the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when they had eaten up the grain which they had brought from Egypt, that their father said to them, go back and buy us a little food. So we need to go back to Egypt and buy some more food. But Jacob, when he says this, it's Judah, brother Judah, who stands up and says, Father, the man in Egypt, he's referring to Joseph, the man in Egypt told us, do not come back here unless your little brother is with you. And he was serious about it. And so if we don't take Benjamin to Egypt, we will not get Simeon back. We will not get grain and food that our family needs. We must take Benjamin. And so Judah says he will take full responsibility for Benjamin's well-being. He will take care of him. And in fact, in verses 8 and 9, he says, if I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame forever. Now, if you go back to chapter 42, if you look at verse 37, Reuben, when they first came back from Egypt with all that grain, they just returned home, Reuben said, Dad, if we have to go back, we've got to take Benjamin, and I will make sure that Benjamin is okay. Reuben said the exact same thing that Judah says here in chapter 43. But when Reuben said it, Jacob completely dismissed it. No way. I am not sending Benjamin. Well, what's different? Now that we're in chapter 43, Judah says it, and now Jacob is willing to go along with it. What's changed? Hunger due to time, right? Time has passed, and Jacob realizes we're in need here. And if we don't act right now, then we're going to be desperate. It's not that Judah's offer was different or better than Reuben's. It was the same thing. It's just Reuben's was offered immediately upon their return from Egypt. Now some time has passed. The situation is more critical. So they make preparations to return to Egypt. In verse 11 and beginning, Israel, Jacob, says, okay, then if you have to do this, if you have to go back and if you have to take Benjamin, then let's prepare a gift that can be given to Joseph. Now, did you have any thoughts that came to your mind about this gift? What did the gift consist of? Okay. The gift consisted of food. It was food items. Now, does that strike you as odd? I mean, we're in a famine. So what's going on there? Okay. All right. So this would be foods that may not be available in Egypt. So these are some foods that are typical major exported goods out of the land of Canaan. Maybe they don't have them in the land of Egypt, but I'm sure you read that and you thought, okay, if you're in a famine and you're hungry and yet you're preparing this gift basket with all this food, why don't you just eat that food? Well, eventually that's going to run out. So I think this is, they're offering what they have, but they know that they don't have enough that's going to last them into this famine that they have no idea how long it's going to last. Wayne?
Yeah, the food items, if you look at the list, appears to be a list that would be a special, if you will, food items that might come only from that land and that might not have been affected by the drought.
And if I'm not mistaken, there were no grain type items in that list, right? So they need grain. I'm sorry?
Honey, nuts, all
Yeah, it's not grains. It's not barley. It's not oats. It's not that kind of thing. It's,
Spices and such.
yes, right. So maybe these are things that were not affected by the famine, but they need grain, so they've got to go back to Egypt. Okay, now, in chapter 43, verses 16 through 34, the brothers make their return. They appear before Joseph, and he tells his servant to take the brothers to his house for a feast. Now, the brothers, I think, assume that they're going to be captured. They're going to be taken as prisoners because these are those guys who stole all that grain the last time they came because they didn't pay for it. Remember? They came with money. They bought the grain, but then when they returned home, they had the grain and their money back in their sacks. So they don't understand how that has happened. So they are invited into Joseph's house, and surely they have no idea what is about to happen. So Joseph's servant settles their fears, and he tells them, I had your money. I gave it back to you. Nothing to worry about there. And then their brother Simeon is returned to them, and they wait for their meal with Joseph. That's going to happen at noon. Now, when Joseph arrives, the brothers presented their gift to him that they had brought from Canaan. And Joseph sees his younger brother Benjamin, and he was so overcome by emotion that he had to leave. He could not stay in the room with them. But when he returns, this is really interesting. When he returns, he segregates the seating of all the people that are there. So the Egyptian people, including Joseph, sit in one area, and the Hebrews, his brothers, sit in another. They don't sit together. And his brothers, Joseph orders that they be seated by age, from oldest to youngest. Now, think about this if you're one of Joseph's brothers. How would Joseph know how would he know the birth order of all of these children? Well, to them, there's no way he could know that. And if it was 3 brothers who were all born 3 or 4 years apart, okay, you don't have to be a genius to figure that out. But if you go back several chapters in the book of Genesis, you had a new brother born every 2 verses. I mean, these guys were born 1 year after another. How would Joseph know? Surely that was a puzzle to them. But finally, Benjamin, who is seated last, is given portions of food 5 times larger than that of his brothers. It says in verse 34. Now, this is really interesting. And I want you to make sure you see this connection, okay? As we come into chapter 44, Joseph is going to test his brothers. And he's going to see if they have changed. Are they different men now than they were 22 years ago? So, of course, you remember from chapter 37 that Joseph was his father's favorite son, and he was given a special blessing by his father in that coat that he was given. None of the other brothers were given that. He was given special treatment. And that special treatment, plus the dreams and such, but that special favoritism that Jacob showed toward Joseph ended up with the brothers being jealous and treating Joseph in a very evil way. Now, at this feast, Joseph has just treated Benjamin in a very favorable way, much more favorable than all the other brothers. Benjamin received similar treatment to Joseph in the episode with the jacket, with the coat that he was given. How are the brothers going to react now that Benjamin has received special favor from this great man in Egypt. You see the parallel? The test that Joseph is beginning is being set up even at this feast. So, are they going to show concern for Benjamin in just a little while when he ends up in serious trouble? Or are they going to cast him off like they did Joseph? So, it's now time for Joseph to send the brothers back to Egypt. He gives them all the grain that they need, and he tells his servant, hey, when they start headed back, I want you to take my silver cup, and I want you to put that in Benjamin's sack. So the servant does that. Then the brothers go off, and they start making their way home, and then Joseph says to the servant, chase them down. Recover my silver cup. Now, what is this going to do to Benjamin? This is going to put him in serious trouble, because now Benjamin could be accused of theft. You've stolen from this mighty man in Egypt. You stole his silver cup. Now, if the brothers haven't changed, if they're the same men that they were 22 years previous when Joseph got his special coat, and they just cast him off and said, let's get rid of him, now they know without a doubt that Benjamin is the new favorite, right? What was Jacob saying when they first came back from it? You're not taking Benjamin to Egypt. You're not taking him. I can't lose him too. Benjamin is Jacob's favorite now. And this man in Egypt, Joseph, has shown Benjamin special favor by giving him a great food portion. Even this stranger in Egypt loves Benjamin. So now when Benjamin gets in trouble, are they going to cast him off? Or are they going to stand up and fight for their brother? Okay? So Joseph's servant comes, overtakes the caravan, and he accuses him, you stole my master's silver cup. We did not. And he starts searching. And he starts with the oldest, and he works his way one by one all the way down, knowing full well exactly where the cup is. He knows it's in Benjamin's sack. But the tension is building. And he opens the sack and he finds it in Benjamin's sack. And everyone is stunned. So in chapter 44, verse 13, they tore their clothes, and each man loaded his donkey and returned to the city. They go back to Egypt, back to where Joseph is. So, verse 14, Judah and his brothers. Why is Judah mentioned? Why is he specifically mentioned? What did he tell his father? I will be personally responsible for Benjamin's well-being. Okay? So Judah is taking ownership here. Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house. They fell before him on the ground. Joseph said, what is this that you have done? Did you not know that such a man as I can certainly practice divination? There's actually a couple references to that in this chapter. Verse 5 and verse 15 both mention Joseph practicing divination. I'm a little conflicted on what I think about that. There's some who think that he really was practicing divination as the Egyptian magicians would do. I'm kind of inclined to think that he actually did not do that, but he's saying, all the other Egyptian powerful guys would do this. That would be their customary practice. And if they do that, they would do it out of a special cup like this. And so they would expect that Joseph would be doing the same thing. They say to him, verse 16, what shall we say? How shall we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Here we are, my Lord's slaves, both we and he also whom the cup was. We can't deny it. The cup was there. We are blown away at what has happened, but we are guilty, and we are all here ready to become your slaves. And Joseph, remember that this is a test. Joseph says, no, there's no need for that. You don't all need to become my slaves. Just let the one who's guilty of stealing it become the slave. Let me just have your youngest brother. Let him be the slave. Now, verse 17 is when Joseph says that. So in verse 18, Judah came near, and he, in a long message that goes through the rest of the chapter, a beautiful message, he begs Joseph to not take Benjamin. He says, you need to understand that if we lose Benjamin, it will kill my father. My father will die because he has lost his youngest son. So, they've passed the test. They didn't say, as they did with Joseph 22 years before, oh, he's the favorite. Let's just write him off and get rid of him. Benjamin is in trouble. This is the perfect opportunity for us to cast him off, just like we did Joseph. Let's get rid of him. No, Judah stands up and intercedes for Benjamin and pleads for him and for their father. And Joseph sees, my brothers are different men. So, chapter 45. Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, make everyone go away from me. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. Don't you kind of wish you could feel the inflection in the words of the page, right? Man, what do you think is going through his brother's mind? What's going through Joseph's mind? I mean, Joseph had all this time to work this out, and as we saw, Joseph recognized his brothers earlier, but they didn't know him. But Joseph has all of this worked out, and yet this is still emotionally overwhelming to Joseph. And the brothers are astounded. Can you even imagine the feelings that are in that room? So Joseph says, verse 5, do not be angry or grieved with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me here before you to preserve life. For these 2 years, the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will neither be plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and do not delay. We're going to see these verses again in our worship hour in the sermon this morning. But we often quote Genesis 50 and verse 20, where Joseph says these exact words. As for you, you meant this for evil, but God meant this for good, to bring about the salvation of many people. But Joseph says the exact same thing here in chapter 45. So Joseph has an awareness of God's hand in all of this. And we're going to talk about that some in our sermon this morning. So, now the brothers are going to go back and tell Jacob that they are going to relocate to Egypt, where the grain is, but more importantly, where Joseph is. In chapter 45 and verse 14 and 15, he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them, and after that his brothers talked with him. Benjamin was very young when Joseph was sold off into slavery 22 years before, and yet he was old enough to know Joseph. I don't think Benjamin was an infant. Okay, he was younger than Joseph, but he was old enough to know Joseph well. And he is grateful to see Joseph, but I think he's also grateful that he's not going to prison for the rest of his life. That this whole thing with the silver cup and his sack and all that was a big, he would have said is a big misunderstanding. I'm not guilty of doing this, but this is all worked out, and even more incredibly, it worked out because Joseph made this work out. How wonderful it is to be reunited with our brother. Okay. I know I've been doing all the talking. I'm sorry about that. I usually try to have room for comments, but I have 4 chapters to cover, so I'm just trying to make sure we get through everything. Wayne, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing I'll mention. I think it might be important for us to understand that Joseph, his confession about God just a few minutes ago that we talked about, and that God had sent him there, tells me that Joseph was having an impact also on the people of that land. If we go back to the previous chapter in verse 44, where the brothers first meet the steward has something to say that I think you ought to take note of, and if I can find it here right quickly, he basically makes a comment
Your God.
that God,
Yeah.
your God, the God of your fathers,
Yes.
the one who is guiding this. So how did that steward know that? Could it be that Joseph was teaching, or Joseph's influence on others about God also was having an influence on the people around him? There's other references too, I forget where they were, chapter 41, I think it was, mentioned that Pharaoh himself made a similar comment to Joseph about God and God's influence. So
Really good.
people of the land of Egypt who at least had some knowledge of God, even if they were not the godly people that Jacob, Joseph, and his brothers were.
That's a really good comment. There are several instances in the scriptures where God's people are in a foreign land and they have direct influence on pagan authorities. Daniel comes to mind with Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, and it would be very easy, I think, for people in those circumstances to lament their situation. Man, I'm here in Babylon. I wish I was back home in Jerusalem. And yet they stay faithful to God, and they end up having a great impact on the unbelievers around them. Okay? What else? Joe?
Just think about the burden that these brothers carried for that long, because it seems to indicate that they haven't told Jacob either up to this point. And it doesn't record the conversation, but you would think it would have to explain what happened once they reunited.
You remember that time we brought that jacket back and it had blood all over it? Yeah, we were joking. Yeah, what a terrible conversation that would have been. Not they wouldn't have said we were joking. They would have said, we're really sorry about what we did. We were terrible people back then. Wow. All right, so at the end of chapter 45, Pharaoh hears of the events that Joseph's family has come to him, and he welcomes them into Egypt as well. And he says, come, move to the land of Goshen. You can take this wonderful land. And not only can you move to this land, but he gives them wagons to help move all of their people and their possessions. He gives them other necessities for their trip back home and the trip back to Egypt that they're going to take. And so the brothers leave Egypt. They go back to Jacob. They tell him Joseph is still alive. He is ruling in Egypt. And of course, Jacob cannot believe the news because he has believed a lie for all of these years. But it's interesting that when he finally believed it, it says in verse 27 that his spirit revived. It's like Jacob got life again. And I think that we can intellectually understand that. I'm sure that there are some people who have even a greater understanding, an actual understanding of that. But Jacob has thought that his child was dead all these years, and now he is alive. Just imagine how that would have lifted his spirits, right? We could see people today who maybe they get a phone call that their child's been in a serious car accident, and they're at the hospital. And we don't know. It's touch and go. We don't know if they're going to make it. And so, you drive to the hospital. You're just anxious and worried, and you're scared. And then you get there, and your child revives, and you can just feel how that would lift your spirit, right? But that's just a short term. And think about 22 years of thinking your child is dead. So, in chapter 46, now it's time to move the family to Egypt. So as Jacob has decided to agree to this and move to Goshen and go see his son Joseph, the Lord speaks to him in a vision. And he reiterates his promise that he would make his family into a great nation in Egypt. In verse 3, he said, "I am God, the God of your father, Isaac. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Joseph will touch your face." So Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones, their wives, in the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They took their livestock, their goods, which they'd acquired in Canaan. They're moving everything, okay? This is the Clampetts rolling into Beverly Hills with everything that they have. And when they get there, they're going to settle in the land of Goshen, which is, as I said, this very nice, very lush, beautiful area of Egypt. So in chapter 46, verses 8 through 27, you're given a listing of Jacob's descendants that went to Egypt. There are 70 people total of Jacob's family who were in Goshen. It says toward the end of that, in verse 26, it says there were 66 persons in all, and the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who went to Egypt were thus 70. So you have 66 that came from Canaan. There's 4 in the land of Egypt already, and that's where the 70 comes from. Okay, Joseph, his wife, and 2 sons. All right. Then in verses 28 to 34, Joseph is reunited with his father in this very touching scene. After 22 years of separation, with Jacob's mistaken belief that Joseph was dead, these 2 men embrace, and what Jacob says is beautiful. He says in verse 30, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you're still alive." Jacob is not saying, "Hey, look, I've missed you for 22 years. I'm really glad to see you. Now, if I died, that would be fine." He's saying, "I can die in peace, knowing that we've been reunited. You've been alive all of this time when I thought you were dead. And now my soul, whenever I die, my soul can go to the grave at rest because I know that you're alive and you're well." Okay? It's kind of an odd way of phrasing. We don't really talk like that. But Jacob is not wishing for his immediate death. Then Joseph says in verse 31, "I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and those of my father's house who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for their occupation has been to feed livestock, and they have brought their flocks, their herds, and all that they have. So it shall be," now this is what he says to his brothers, "when Pharaoh calls you and says, 'What is your occupation?' that you shall say, 'Your servant's occupation has been with livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers. Every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians.'" So Joseph says, don't tell him you're shepherds. Tell him that you work with livestock. Don't tell him you're shepherds. Egyptians don't like shepherds. I must have read 11 or 12 different commentaries, and none of them had an explanation as to why Egyptians don't like shepherds. I don't know. So, in fact, most of the ones that I read didn't even address it, which means they don't know either. But Joseph says, don't tell Pharaoh that you're shepherds. Now, just skip ahead, look at chapter 47. Verse 3. Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, we are shepherds. Okay, Joseph's brothers have changed. They're different men, but they're not very smart men. I did wonder if there might be some kind of religious component to the Egyptian hatred of shepherds. Maybe they venerate sheep or something. I don't know. Whatever it is. But Joseph says, psst, don't tell Pharaoh. And then that's exactly what they did. All right. Yes. Jerry knows. Jerry's going to tell us.
Three conditions you had to meet in order to face Pharaoh. You couldn't be an eater of fish. You had to shave from head to toe.
Wait, what was the first thing you said? You couldn't be a what?
Eater of fish.
Oh, you couldn't.
They all common people go.
Interesting.
And then you had to shave from head to toe. The Bible said he shaved.
Right.
We thought it was scuffy beard. Now we got to shave from head to foot.
Okay, and then you said there were three. What was the third one? You can't be a shepherd. That's probably the third one, right? All right. Here's the big idea, and then Thane, I'll come to you. I want you to catch this. Go back, way back to Genesis 12. Remember the promises made to Abraham. The land promise. The nation, the seed promise. This nation of Israel is not yet formed, but it's about to start. And from this large family of 70 people is going to come a nation of a couple of million or more. Okay? A huge nation will come from this nucleus that is now in the land of Egypt, and they're going to be there for about 400 years. Okay? Thane?
Just quickly on the whole shepherd prohibition thing. Both mine and Lauren's versions here actually say that when Joseph is telling them, don't, he says, I'm sending to Pharaoh to let him know that my family has come here to raise livestock. They are shepherds. So he's already telling Pharaoh that they are shepherds. So I don't know what the whole thing is about. Telling them.
Yeah, he does say shepherds and sheep and livestock, but emphasize the livestock more than the sheep is kind of the impression that I get. But I still don't know why, and it ultimately doesn't matter. But Jeff,
I didn't get that impression, and also something our book mentioned that would be totally different. That we wanted them to know they were shepherds because this put them in a place where no Egyptian would then go. They could be people to be apart from them.
yes, I do remember reading that. And the book, the Waldron book, does say something about, well, the fact that they were shepherds would have meant that they could stay isolated, right? Which is an important concept for Israel moving forward. But it still doesn't say what's the aversion to sheep and shepherding. I still don't know what that is about.
Yeah, I don't know
But
what that is either, but mine doesn't have the same translation as him, where it equates saying they are shepherds with because they have been to feed livestock. That's their
yeah.
So it equated those two things.
Mhm.
But when they said shepherd or feed livestock, meant the same thing.
Okay. Good. All right. The growth of this nation. This is the working out of that promise to Abraham. Okay, again, that's the big idea that I don't want us to miss. God is still keeping the promises that he made to Abraham long ago. And he said them to Isaac, and he said them to Jacob. And Jacob is probably thinking, well, wait a minute. You said we were going to have the land of Canaan. Now you're telling us to relocate to Egypt. And I think that's why God appears to Jacob in the vision and says, go on down to Egypt. I will be with you. Yes, this is from me. I want you to do that. But I'll bring you back. I'll bring your people back to the land that I promised you. All right. Thank you very much.